There are a few things worth establishing before anything else. The money was real. The documentation was clear. What Sophie did was not ambiguous, not a misunderstanding, not a matter of differing interpretations of a verbal agreement. Over 8 months, she had moved $34,000 from the estate account into her personal checking in increments small enough to avoid automatic flags. $800 here, $1,200 there. Once a clean $3,000 on a Tuesday in November that she apparently felt confident about. Daniel had found this out not by confronting her, but by going through the records himself one evening in February with a spreadsheet and more patience than the situation deserved. He had suspected for a while. He had not wanted to be right. The room where she told him was his own living room. That detail still catches him sometimes. That she chose his space, his couch, his coffee table between them. She'd asked to come over, which was unusual enough that he'd noticed it. Sophie didn't typically ask. Sophie appeared, or didn't, on terms that suited Sophie. She sat in the chair by the window. She held her coffee with both hands. She looked, he would later think, like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had finally decided to put it down regardless of where they were standing when they did it. She told him flatly. Not all the details. She didn't know he already had the details. But the fact of it. That she'd taken money from the account. That she'd needed it. That she hadn't known how to ask. He listened. He didn't say anything immediately, which was unusual for him. He is, by nature and by years of practice, someone who responds, who manages, who finds the next practical step and moves toward it. The silence lasted long enough that Sophie apparently felt it required filling. "And what are you going to do now?" she said. Then, after a beat, with something in her voice he still hasn't found the right word for. Not quite contempt, not quite challenge, something that lived between them. "Sue me?" He looked at her. He smiled. He doesn't fully know why. It was the kind of smile that happens before you've decided on it. Then he said he had some things to take care of, and he showed her out, and he stood in his own hallway for a moment after the door closed, looking at nothing. The theft, he has since decided, was not the event. The event was the question. And what are you going to do now? Because that question contained a complete theory of him. It assumed he was the kind of person who would receive this information and calculate, quickly, reflexively, the way he always had, what pursuit would cost against what silence would preserve. It assumed he loved her enough, or feared the disruption enough, or was tired enough to absorb it. It assumed he was still, at 43, the same 15-year-old who had looked at a household coming apart and decided that his job was to hold it together regardless of personal cost. She had been operating on that theory for a long time. The money almost made sense once he understood that. Not morally, nothing about it was moral, but psychologically. She had access because he'd given her access, and she'd used it because she'd believed, correctly based on all available evidence, that the consequences would be internal to Daniel, and therefore manageable from her end. She had borrowed against his nature the way you borrow against an asset you're confident won't be called in. He had spent the drive home understanding this. By the time he got inside, he had decided to answer her question. Some context that matters. Their father left when Daniel was 15 and Sophie was 11. This is not an excuse for anything, it's simply load-bearing information. Daniel became, in the aftermath, the person who managed things. Not because he was asked. Because someone had to, and he was the oldest, and that is how these arrangements calcify. When their mother was diagnosed, 8 years ago now, Daniel coordinated the care, the appointments, the medications, the conversations with the doctors that their mother couldn't retain and needed someone to translate into plain language afterward. Sophie came when she could, which was for birthdays and for the easier hospital visits, the ones where their mother was lucid and the room felt almost normal. The harder ones, the 3 a.m. calls, the paperwork, the long Tuesday afternoons in waiting rooms with bad lighting, those were Daniel's. He hadn't resented it exactly. He'd resented the invisibility of it, which is a different thing. When their mother died and the estate needed managing, Daniel had set up the account. He added Sophie because it was her mother too, because he wanted her involved, because after years of her peripheral presence he had some hope, not fully examined, probably naive, that shared responsibility might mean something. She had experienced it, he now understood, as access. Gerald Marsh had handled the estate probate. He was 61, methodical, and had an office that smelled like old paper and good sense. Daniel called him that evening. The conversation was practical. Daniel laid out what he had: the account records, the transfer history, the spreadsheet he'd built in February that he hadn't known at the time he was building for this purpose. Gerald asked several questions. He was quiet for a moment after Daniel finished. Then Gerald told him what was viable, which was, given the documentation, quite a lot. Daniel authorized him to proceed, and then, because there was nothing else to do, went to bed. He slept better than he expected to. He has thought about that since, what it means that the decision brought him calm. He hasn't reached a comfortable conclusion. Gerald called Sophie at 9:15 the following morning. Daniel wasn't present for this. He knows it happened because Gerald reported back, and because Sophie called him 3 times between 9:40 and 10:20, calls he watched arrive and did not answer. He has since pieced together what Gerald's call contained: the legal characterization of the transfers, the documentation already in hand, the formal nature of what was now in motion. Gerald's manner, Daniel knows from experience, would have been entirely pleasant throughout. Gerald is always pleasant. He delivers difficult information the way a good doctor does, clearly, without editorial, without any indication that he finds it remarkable that this is the situation you've arrived at together. Sophie left 1 voicemail and 2 texts. The voicemail was 4 minutes long. He listened to it once, the following day, with the particular attention he gives to things he expects to find difficult. It was not an apology. It contained, in rough order, an explanation of why she'd needed the money, a reframing of the money as something she'd always felt was inequitably distributed from their mother's estate, a reference to everything she had been through that he apparently did not understand or account for, and a closing suggestion that pursuing this legally was a form of cruelty that said more about him than about her. He listened to the whole thing. He was looking for something specific, some indication. Not an apology necessarily, not a formal admission. Just some evidence that she understood what she had done. Not the transfers. The question: and what are you going to do now? He was listening for any sign that she recognized what she'd revealed when she said that. He didn't find it. What he found instead was the theory of him, still intact, now reframed. She was distressed, and her distress would move him, and the dare still stood even inside a legal process, because Daniel would ultimately find the cost of continuing too high and would stop. He put his phone down. He did not call her back. 12 days later, Sophie's husband called. His name was Kevin. Daniel liked Kevin, or had, a straightforward man, good with their mother during visits. Someone who existed in the family the way reliable furniture exists in a room, present, functional, unremarked upon. Kevin calling was new. Kevin calling meant the thing had moved beyond the private register of siblings and into the larger register of a life, a marriage, a household that now knew. Sophie had, he realized, gambled that Daniel would keep it contained, that whatever he did, he would do quietly, between them, the way he'd always handled difficult things in this family, internally, without broadcast, absorbing the cost of management so that no one else had to feel the weight of it. Gerald did not operate that way. Gerald operated on the record. Kevin's call was short. He wasn't angry. He was careful, which was worse. He said he hoped there was a way to resolve things without it going further. Daniel said he hoped so too, which was true in the way that statements can be true without being complete. After the call, he sat in his car in a parking structure for a few minutes, doing nothing. He thought about a specific afternoon from their childhood. He couldn't have been more than 12, which made Sophie 8, when they'd built something together in the backyard, some elaborate and ultimately structurally unsound construction involving planks and rope and a concept of a fort that exceeded their engineering ability. They'd worked on it all day. It had collapsed before dinner. Sophie had cried, and he'd told her they'd build a better one. And they hadn't. Because summer ended and they forgot. The way children forget. He thought about that for a while. Then, he drove home. The counteroffer came through Gerald 6 weeks into the process. Sophie sighed. She had retained someone, a cousin of Kevin's who did family law, proposed returning $21,000 of the $34,000, with a signed agreement that no further legal action would be pursued, and a clause about confidentiality that Gerald described as standard but read to Daniel as one more attempt to manage what he was allowed to do with his own experience. He sat across from Gerald in the office that smelled like paper. He was not thinking about the number. He was thinking about what acceptance meant versus what continuation meant, and what each of those cost, not financially, not even emotionally exactly, but in terms of what he had remaining to spend. He had a business. He had friends he hadn't called in months. He had a life that had narrowed over the past several years of caregiving and estate management, and now this, to a series of problems requiring his attention. He thought, I am tired in a way that has a specific shape now. He accepted the settlement, not because it satisfied him, because continuing required a sustained anger he didn't have, and he had learned enough about himself in the past few months to know that proceeding from exhaustion rather than conviction produces outcomes nobody can live with cleanly. The money came back. Most of it. Sophie did not. He isn't certain how he feels about that second part, which is itself information. There was a time when the idea of genuine estrangement from his sister would have been unbearable. He would have paid almost any cost to prevent it, and had. And that was precisely the mechanism she'd relied on. Now there is something that is not relief, but is adjacent to it. A loosening. The particular quiet of a person who has stopped bracing. He answered her question. What are you going to do? He did a thing. The thing changed the shape of what existed between them, probably permanently, possibly entirely. He would make the same decision again. He is not completely certain that means he made the right one. He has spent enough time thinking about it to know that certainty isn't available here, that the most honest position is that he acted from the clearest information he had, and accepted what followed. That is not victory. He is not sure what it is. Some mornings he thinks about the fort in the backyard, the planks, the rope, the concept that exceeded the execution. He thinks about 8-year-old Sophie crying in the grass, and himself saying, we'll build a better one, with the complete confidence of someone who doesn't yet know that summers end, and things get forgotten, and some constructions only happen once. He doesn't know what to do with that memory now. He keeps it anyway. It seems important not to throw away the parts that were real just because the structure didn't hold.